Imagine opening your eyes to the sounds of shouting outside your window. The Roman Empire, the greatest power the world had ever known, is not the shining marvel your grandparents remembered. Instead, it is a place where hunger, fear, and despair cling to every corner. Once upon a time, the streets overflowed with parades of legionaries in polished armor, markets brimming with spices from Arabia and silk from the East. Now, the parades are gone, the markets half empty, and people whisper of enemy armies moving closer each day. For the ordinary citizen of Rome, the fall of the empire was not an abstract tale of politics and generals, but the daily struggle to survive in a world that seemed to be collapsing beneath their feet. Life had not always been this grim. The Roman Empire once stretched from the deserts of Africa to the cold forests of Britain. Rome itself had been a glittering city, filled with fountains, theaters, and temples where citizens proudly called themselves masters of the known world. But by the time of decline, these monuments were not signs of glory. They were heavy reminders of what had been lost. Families walked past crumbling columns, children played in the shadows of half-abandoned amphitheaters, and no one could ignore how fragile the empire had become. The first cracks appeared in daily life. Money, once the pride of Rome with its golden coins stamped with the emperor's face, was losing its value. Merchants grew reluctant to sell their goods for coins that meant little, and many began demanding payment in grain, cattle, or even clothing instead. A loaf of bread that once cost a small copper now cost dozens. The wealthy hoarded food, while the poor stood in lines that stretched endlessly, praying to get a ration before supplies ran out. Some families secretly bartered in back alleys, swapping tools or jewelry for a handful of barley to last another day. The empire, once rich beyond imagination, now struggled to feed its people. Fear seeped into every conversation. The names of barbarian tribes became constant reminders that the empire's enemies were no longer faraway threats. Whispers of the Goths burning villages in the north or the Vandals storming across farmlands in the west spread like wildfire. Refugees from these regions flooded into Roman towns, carrying little more than the clothes on their backs. They brought stories of homes destroyed, children taken, and entire communities left in ashes. Ordinary Romans listened with wide eyes, wondering if their city would be next. Mothers tightened their hold on their children. Fathers sharpened old swords though they hadn't been soldiers in decades. The fear was not if the barbarians would come, but when. The once proud army that had protected Rome for centuries was no longer the same force. Soldiers had been the pride of the empire, disciplined and fierce, conquering lands from Britain to Egypt. But during the decline, the legions were underpaid, undisciplined, and increasingly made up of mercenaries who had little loyalty to Rome itself. A farmer who saw soldiers passing through his village did not feel pride. He felt anxiety because soldiers often took food by force when pay was delayed. Many deserted, vanishing into the countryside to become bandits, preying on the very people they were meant to protect. Parents warned their children not to wander too close to the roads, where deserters and thieves roamed freely. Rome's shield was broken, and everyone could feel it. Yet in the midst of fear, life went on. Families still tried to keep some normalcy. Children played with carved wooden toys, women baked bread when flour could be found, and men tried to keep farms alive despite crushing taxes. But daily rituals had changed. Bathhouses, once the center of gossip and relaxation, were deserted because aqueducts fell into disrepair. Public feasts, once a mark of Rome's generosity, disappeared, leaving only private meals where people counted every bite. Hunger and scarcity reshaped society. Religion became a beacon in the darkness. In earlier times, Romans prayed to Jupiter, Mars, and Venus for blessings. But as the empire weakened, these gods seemed silent. More and more people turned to Christianity, seeking hope in a faith that promised salvation beyond the crumbling world. Churches overflowed with people seeking comfort, prayers echoing louder than the once bustling festivals of the old gods. Bishops became more powerful voices than senators, and ordinary citizens followed them as spiritual guides in a time when emperors seemed powerless. Inside the imperial palace, chaos reigned. Emperors rose and fell with alarming speed, some ruling for months, others for just days before being assassinated or overthrown. For the ordinary citizen, it was impossible to keep track of who sat on the throne. News of a new emperor brought no celebration, only shrugs or nervous jokes. How long will this one last? Politics had become a bloody game, disconnected from the struggles of the common people. While leaders fought over crowns, ordinary men and women worried only about bread, safety, and keeping their families alive. The breaking point came with the unthinkable, the sack of Rome in 410 by Alaric and the Visigoths. For centuries, Romans had believed their city was untouchable, protected by walls, gods, and sheer reputation. But when the walls were breached, panic erupted. Streets once filled with laughter became battlegrounds. Families barricaded their doors, praying invaders would pass them by. Temples were looted, noble villas burned, and treasures carried off. Flames lit up the night sky, casting eerie shadows on the faces of terrified citizens. Some tried to bribe invaders with hidden jewelry, others hid in churches, hoping holy ground would shield them. For the first time in history, Rome itself had fallen to enemy hands. The survivors were left to rebuild among ashes. Temples once grand stood blackened, their marble cracked by fire. Homes lay in ruins, and bodies were carried to mass graves. For those who lived through it, the sack was not just a military defeat, it was a psychological shattering. The Eternal City, the heart of the empire, had been violated. People whispered that the gods had abandoned Rome. The myth of invincibility was gone, replaced by the raw reality of vulnerability. Yet even then, life had to continue. Survivors scavenged among ruins for wood to rebuild. Churches became shelters where families huddled together, and markets reopened slowly, trading whatever scraps people could spare. Some clung to the hope that Rome would recover its glory, while others quietly wondered if the age of Rome was truly over. For the ordinary people, the fall of Rome was not a sudden collapse but a series of blows: economic struggles, political chaos, military weakness, and finally, the terror of invasion. Each day brought new uncertainty, and each night ended with the same haunting question: would tomorrow be better, or would it be worse? And as the smoke of the sack cleared, the truth settled like dust over the city. Rome would never again be the Rome they had known. The empire was slipping away, and for those living through it, survival had become the only victory left. The sack of Rome was only the beginning. The empire that had ruled continents now stumbled like a wounded giant, losing strength with every passing year. For ordinary people, the decline was no longer a distant threat, but an everyday reality. Provinces that once supplied food and wealth slipped out of Rome's grasp. Britain was abandoned, Gaul fractured, and Spain lost to invading forces. Merchants who had once filled Roman markets with olive oil, wine, spices, and silk could no longer guarantee safe trade routes. Caravans vanished along the roads, ships disappeared on seas now swarming with pirates, and the flow of luxury goods slowed to a trickle. What remained was hunger. Markets that once displayed vibrant colors of foreign cloth and baskets of exotic fruits were reduced to stalls selling simple grain or salted meat, and even that was often too expensive for most families to buy. Life became harsher, stripped of the comforts Romans had long taken for granted. Roads once patrolled by soldiers grew dangerous, bridges collapsed without repair, and aqueducts cracked, leaving neighborhoods dry. Ordinary citizens adapted by carrying buckets from rivers, by mending their own tools instead of buying new ones, and by learning to live without the little luxuries their grandparents had seen as normal. In this new world, survival was measured not in gold or marble, but in the ability to find food, shelter, and safety. Religion grew into a lifeline. With the empire unable to protect its citizens, many turned to Christianity as the only anchor in a collapsing world. Churches became more than places of worship. They were community centers, shelters, and food distributors. Priests and bishops, once overshadowed by senators and generals, now commanded deep respect. They organized aid, cared for the sick, and even negotiated with barbarian leaders. To a desperate population, Christianity offered something the empire could no longer provide: hope. For many, salvation and eternal life promised by the faith mattered more than the fate of emperors. The shift was so profound that festivals once dedicated to Jupiter or Mars fell silent, replaced by hymns echoing from basilicas. But no faith could erase the fear of new invaders. The most terrifying name whispered across the empire was Attila the Hun. Stories of his advance spread faster than his armies. Refugees fled into cities, recounting villages burned to the ground, families massacred, and survivors enslaved. Mothers hushed their children when the name Attila was spoken. Fathers prayed they would never see his horsemen on the horizon. To ordinary Romans, the Huns were not just another enemy. They were a storm from the east, unstoppable and merciless. Rome itself trembled, preparing for the possibility that the city could once again be under siege. As invasions and wars dragged on, the very idea of being Roman began to change. The polished togas and gleaming armor that once symbolized identity were replaced by practical tunics and rough cloaks borrowed from so-called barbarians. Latin, once spoken with pride, blended with Germanic and local dialects as new rulers imposed their own customs. Children growing up in these years no longer dreamed of serving Rome. They grew up learning the languages, weapons, and traditions of invaders who now ruled their homelands. What it meant to be Roman slowly faded, and with it, the unity that had held the empire together for centuries. Cultural life suffered as well. Gladiatorial games, once the blood-soaked heart of entertainment, ended. Not only were they too expensive to stage, but Christian leaders condemned them as cruel. Amphitheaters stood empty, their stone seats crumbling, their arenas silent. Artistic achievements slowed to a trickle, with fewer grand statues or mosaics commissioned. Architecture that had once boasted of Rome's power gave way to simple, functional buildings. The city still bore the scars of its greatness, but each day the scars looked more like ruins. By the mid-5th century, the empire was a shadow of itself. Armies barely held the frontiers, emperors were more figureheads than leaders, and generals often wielded the real power. Corruption and betrayal became routine. Many ordinary citizens stopped caring who the emperor was, because emperors came and went so quickly that their names mattered little to survival. What mattered was food, safety, and the ability to endure another season. The final blow came in 476 CE, when Romulus Augustulus, the last emperor of the West, was deposed by Odoacer. The symbolism was undeniable. A boy emperor stripped of his crown by a barbarian general marked the end of Roman rule in the West. Yet for the average citizen, the moment was less dramatic than history books later described. Most Romans woke that day the same as any other, worried about feeding their children, patching roofs, or avoiding bandits. News spread that there was no emperor, but many shrugged. The empire had been failing for so long that its official end felt like confirmation of what people already knew. Rome was gone. For some, there was grief. Elders who remembered the glory days wept for the empire's collapse. Scholars mourned the loss of libraries and traditions. But for others, there was relief. A system that had taxed them mercilessly, drafted their sons into wars, and failed to protect their homes was finally over. Under new rulers, life might not improve immediately, but at least the endless cycle of false hopes and broken promises was finished. Ordinary people adjusted, as humans always do, by focusing on survival and making the best of their circumstances. Life after the fall was not a void, but a transformation. Rome became just another city, no longer the center of the world, but still a place where people lived, traded, and worshipped. Roads and aqueducts, though crumbling, still served communities. Roman law and customs lingered, woven into the fabric of new kingdoms. Farmers tilled the soil, artisans worked their craft, and children grew up in a world their grandparents would hardly recognize, but that was theirs nonetheless. The collapse of the empire was not the end of life, but the beginning of a new chapter, one that would eventually give rise to medieval Europe. For those who lived through it, the fall of Rome was not a single event, but a lifetime of change. It was the slow unraveling of traditions, the loss of stability, the constant fear of war, and the daily battle against hunger. It was also resilience, the ability to endure hardship, to adapt, and to find hope where none seemed possible. The fall was not just history. It was human experience, carried by millions of ordinary men and women who survived one of the greatest turning points in civilization. And in the end, though the empire crumbled, Rome's legacy refused to vanish. Roads built by Roman engineers continued to carry travelers for centuries. Aqueducts inspired future builders. Roman law shaped the justice systems of lands that had never known the empire at its height. Latin evolved into new languages, Italian, French, Spanish, that still echo the voices of Rome. The people who watched their world collapse could not have known it, but their culture would echo far beyond their lifetimes. The fall of Rome was hunger, fear, and loss. It was also survival, resilience, and transformation. For those who lived it, each day was uncertain, each night filled with questions. Would the city stand another year? Would food last through the winter? Would their children see peace? History remembers the fall as a date in 476, but for the people themselves, it was life. Hard, painful, and unforgettable. And though the empire died, the world it shaped continued to grow, proving that even in collapse, the echoes of greatness never truly disappear.